Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points with Matt and Matt. Today, we're going to. We're kind of going to be talking about two things simultaneously, but they go together fairly well. So, hopefully, we'll manage to kind of have two conversations at once, or maybe we'll just have the first conversation, or we'll have one conversation first and then the other one after. But we're going to talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But we're also going to talk on how that touches on our views regarding political violence and when political violence is justified and when it's not justified, and so on and so forth. Um, uh, but of course, I suppose I'll be the one to issue the caveats since my friend here is totally red pilled. But well, I'll issue the caveat that neither of us are foreign policy experts. Um, this is and we were a little hesitant to talk about this issue because it's so complicated and there are various factors involved. So obviously, don't take everything we say with a grain of salt. But we have some general thoughts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which hopefully are interesting to listen to. But anyway, um, I actually think the issues between Israel and Palestine are fairly simple, or rather, the solution is fairly simple. Now, of course, if anyone doesn't know, um, well, I don't know why anyone wouldn't know, but just for little explanation purposes, um, there is a conflict of interest in terms of who owns a bit of land in the Middle East, um, because the Palestinian Arabs, mostly Muslim, feel like they um, should own the land that is known as Israel. Um, and Israel, of course, it's Jerusalem is kind of the general area I'm talking about, um, and the surrounding areas. Um, but the Jews also feel as if they are entitled to that land. Um, and there's a long and various history. I mean, originally it was Jewish territory, and then it became, I think, was it the Ottoman Empire? I forget the exact, but then it became um, Arabic Muslim territory. And then after the Second World War, of course, with the Holocaust, people were like, well, we can't have that happen again. We need to give the Jews a state so they'll be protected um, from anything similar to Hitler coming up in history again. So they put it the British um, government um, took the Palestine, and that's where the Jewish state was founded. Um, and I guess I say it's simple because, and this is the talking point. So this obviously doesn't come from me, um, but it's simple in that um, if you just divide the land um, evenly, if you just keep it like you can keep Israel can continue to exist, but if you give Palestine the um, if Palestine can become a state, then um, that really is the best solution. And I mean, it's fairly simple, and it could happen, very quickly if there were political motivation to do it. Now, as far as I can tell, there's no political motivation to do it, partly due to the influence of the United States and conservatives in Israel. Um, Now, some people even make the argument that no, there should be a one-state solution, just a solution, a secular government for where both Arab Muslims and um, Jews kind of can work together in the same government and under the same laws. Um, I mean, I guess in theory, I would say that's a good idea. In practice, I think it's probably better if they just each have their own state and have at least some degree of self-determination, um, which is generally the kind of the basis of a foundation of a state to begin with. But those are just some general thoughts. Um, I'll let Matt jump in here.
Yeah, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict brings up like so many meta issues, I guess, and a bunch of random questions. And when people start proposing solutions, brings up all these ideas of why certain policies don't work in all kinds of situations. So to some extent, I agree that the situation is simple in the same way that I think fixing the United States is simple. But the real issue is there's no political will and there's no political consensus, and that's something that they're seeking in this situation. And in reality, and I think this is really clear if you watch a lot of people who are pro-Israel debate people who are pro-Palestine, is it comes down to intergenerational property rights conflicts. And that ends up being like a really sticky situation where people are just saying things that are all based on feelings, and they're kind of all post hoc rationalizations. And some people are appealing to things that were in biblical times, and some people are appealing to their parents and grandparents that were kicked out of their land not that long ago. So you have like these really weird arguments being made. And I think I'm slower to dismiss some of them out of hand, but like a lot of secular people have no problem because a lot of secular people will listen to like the Israelis that say that they have like a historical um, claim to the land that they're on, and then they'll just dismiss it because it's like that's ridiculous. You're living in a fantasy land. All these other countries denounce it because it violates international law. Um, and it's like that's a fair point. I mean, if you respect international law, that's a fair point. But it's a fair point in the sense that, yeah, you weren't there for thousands of years. It's kind of weird to come back and say it's yours. But now we're getting to the point where a lot of the people who were kicked out were already massacred, and it's people who want the land claims of their grandparents. And I see a lot of parallels with other intergenerational problems that have happened all across history, where it's kind of like how it's just like a very weird thing to measure because it doesn't seem consistent across arguments and ideologies. And I say this more as an observation than me trying to make my own argument, because I'm pretty neutral in the sense that I don't have a solid stake in what happens to the Palestinians and Israelis. It can really go either way and it doesn't affect me. But it just, I can add this like layer of observation and take it from here and look at there, because a lot of things that the Zionists are saying are about how they have property claims back to biblical times. And then in the United States, a lot of people who are Zionists in the United States don't think that former slaves have claims for for the horrendous things that happened in slavery in the United States. So there's just some weird property dynamics there that aren't examined, and I just find it fascinating. In the end, I mean, it's just a terrible situation, and you have atrocities. Well, people get really upset when you say there are atrocities happening on both sides because they're not necessarily equal. And if you think one side is worse than the other, it's usually based on your intrinsic view of who has the legitimate property claim. Because if you talk to a Zionist, they assume that Israel justifiably has the property that their land is on. So when missiles get shot at Israel, they are upset because it seems like an act of terrorism. But like in my mind, if somebody fights back against the United States government, then it doesn't bother me because I think the United States government is the enemy. So if you think you have a right to where the land that Israel's on, and then you're trying to steal it back, then it's not really bad. So that's why I think both the views are so warped, and it's really hard to get like a kind of unbiased, neutral, if those things exist, take on the situation. And that's why I've always been hesitant to talk about it, because we've talked about talking about this issue for 50 episodes. And we since we've known each other, we've kind of wanted to talk about it. And I'm always skeptical, because if you listen to Ben Shapiro, he is in a completely different universe than Noam Chomsky. And it's like they can't even define the same terms. And it's like, sure, in the end, I probably agree more with Chomsky than I do Shapiro, but it's like bizarre that they can't even you can't even understand the situation by listening to them both. You have to listen to like both of them, and then like Scott Horton and other anti-war people in general, to kind of get a grasp a little bit of what's going on. and put it together. So I think that's the intro to my kind of way I look at it, or have been looking at it.
As anyone, as anyone who has listened to the show for a long time, or just even seen an episode or two, would probably know, I am not a religious person at all. So, I mean, in terms of like the theological validity of the claims, either by the Israelis and the Palestinians, obviously, I look at them with total skepticism. Um, but I don't think you can't just stop there. You can't just say, oh, both sides live in a fantasy world because God is dead. That really doesn't solve the issue on the ground. So, but that's why I'm saying, and that's why I think it's defensible to say that a two-state solution is the best solution, because what I hear, I mean, basically what I see in this debate is kind of what you're talking about. It's people are either saying that the people are either saying that one side or the other like has a greater claim to the land, but I don't think you can make that claim either historically or even really theoretically, as far as I can tell. I mean, without again assuming that, well, the Jews just should deserve that land, or the Arab Muslims just deserve that land because that's just how it is. Now, I think generally speaking, especially at least in the United States, well, okay, if you're on the right, of course, you're going to think that the Israel it has the correct claims, and if you're on the left, you're more likely to say the Palestinians have are the ones with the correct claims. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, as terrible as it is, as some people think it is to have a middle of the road position, what I'm trying to say is you can't win, or neither side's really going to win. There's not going to be peace. There's not going to be any. People aren't be able. The lives, at least in Palestine, aren't going to go back to normal unless there's some kind of truce, some kind of diplomatic solution that takes place. One group or another is going to suffer, and at this time, since Israel was founded, it was the Palestinians that are suffering. Not to say that there isn't some like anti-Semitism and whatnot among Palestinians, or there's not to say you can't find terrible propaganda, anti-Israeli propaganda from the Palestinian side. And again, not to defend, well, not to necessarily defend suicide bombing, although we'll get back to like political violence in a second. I would say, like, I mean, both sides have their good and bad eggs, but generally speaking, I'm more critical of Israel on the grounds that they have more power and they're dominating the situation. I mean, I think it was Sam Harris in one of his podcasts who seemed to argue that the Palestinians are dominating in terms of public opinion. But even if that's true, the situation hasn't changed on the ground for the Palestinians. So, in point of fact, based on how countries are behaving and the internal politics of various countries, the Israelis are winning, and I think the way they're winning is by crushing the Palestinians. It's kind of interesting. You mentioned like Zionists, and I'll say this and then I'll let you respond. But like Zionism versus anti-Zionism, what do those words mean? And I once said to someone, I describe myself as an anti-Zionist now, but certain people have very negative associations with that because certain anti-Zionists are in fact anti-Semitic. But I guess I meant I'm kind of when I said I was anti-Zionist, I was anti-Zionist in the sense that I think a Jewish state is absurd because it's a religious state. So I think a Christian state is equally absurd. I think a Muslim state is equally absurd. As far as I'm concerned, the state of Israel should not be a religious state. And I think that was part of the reason why it went so wrong. That and where it was, and the location of which it was chosen to be created. Um, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, you can call me Zionist or anti-Zionist either way, really. I guess I'd lean towards anti-Zionist in the way that I'm describing the word, but I don't necessarily go around proclaiming I'm an anti-Zionist because of certain negative implications that people have. I don't believe the state of Israel needs to be dismantled. I think it exists and it needs to be respected on those grounds, in the sense that, the United States was built on not only slave labor, but genocide of the Native American Indians. And I don't think the United States should be dismantled for that reason. So I'm not, just to be clear, when I say I lean towards anti-Zionist, not in the sense of, Israel needs to be destroyed. I do not, and anyone who believes that is definitely anti-Semitic and insane. But I think that explains my perspective.
Well, I have to put on my anarchist hat because somebody needs to, and the main reason why I feel like that's necessary, though, is because it's kind of overly simplified to look at it as we've now talked through it as Israeli versus Palestinian, but we haven't talked about it in the same way of people who are essentially doing somewhat of a rebellion or a revolution against the state body of Israel. And that's the reason why the left is generally for it, is because in a lot of conflicts, there's one side dominating another side, and then the political left is generally on the side of the people who are being dominated. Because, and this is just like a general rule of thumb. It's not always true, but it's like a general rule. So what we have is we have the Gaza Strip, where a bunch of Palestinians are in conditions that are so substandard and disgusting that I don't think our Western brains can even wrap around it. And people call that a genocide. And you can frame it through the lens of the race and the religion of the people who are involved on each side, or you can frame it as a dominant government using their weapons, their ammunition, and their power as a state institution to dominate a bunch of people. And one thing that I wanted to get to about this whole conflict is it seems just like a collectivist problem that happens when you have two groups that are identified on a macro level instead of as individuals, because you have people who are essentially in the Israeli state that are pretty much defined by their religious views and their race, and any attack against them is seen as attack on their religion. But that's what's so dehumanizing about the conversation, and it's what makes it kind of complex to me. Because you can imagine if people decided that Palestine has the real rights to all the land and that the Israelis should peacefully move, well, then you can think, well, like, what about a 10-year-old Israeli boy who was born there? Like, why should he have to move? He didn't do anything wrong. He was just born there. And he lives in an area that's run by a government that's oppressing a bunch of people that shouldn't be oppressed. So it's like, what does that kid have to do with it? Well, the government did this whole thing and they lock these people up over here and they kind of do things that are inhumane, and the people fight back by shooting rockets at them. So really, in some ways, I think framing it as Palestinians versus Israeli, it almost misses the point that it's almost like one country already. And it's the radicals that don't have representation, and they're technically not in the country, but they might as well be, fighting back against what ends up kind of being their government, because they're the ones that oppress them in the Gaza Strip. So it's not literally their government because they're not recognized as citizens. But I think not applying this type of anarchist lens to it is missing a huge point. And that's why I can comfortably say, as a person who isn't anti-Semitic, that I think Israel should be abolished, because I think it's still a state body. I think it's evil. And I think it uses, if anything, it uses their religious identification as a way to use it for political messaging. And a lot of people are anti-Semitic, and a lot of people are evil, and a lot of people are targeting Israel for anti-Semitic reasons. But it doesn't mean that anybody attacking it is against it for an anti-Semitic reason. There are valid grievances of the people in the Gaza Strip. So I guess what I'm saying is it doesn't bug me that Israel is a religious state. It bugs me it's a state, and it uses its religious grounds as cover. And there are valid reasons why it uses it as cover, because that's a valid cover sometimes. But it uses it all as a cover to cover up what is borderline torture and genocide in the Gaza Strip. And it's the state being evil, and it's collectivism taken to its extended, its logical conclusion to some extent. It's just one group dominating another group because they don't see eye to eye. And it's really dehumanizing. So I had to get that thought out there because I think that's where we might start not agreeing.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. I think, well, what you were saying, I guess I was kind of implying without saying explicitly. But yeah, I mean, I was only framing it in the sense of two states, in terms of what I think the solution should be. I think the solution should be putting aside the states are evil thing for a second, putting aside your anarchist hat for a second. The Palestinians, because we live in a world where states exist, and I don't think they're going away tomorrow. Whether or not they should go away, I just think it's a slightly different question in this scenario, because, well, Israel has a state. So I think I don't think the answer then is to, this is where we disagree. The answer is not to dismantle Israel tomorrow. The answer is to create a Palestinian state tomorrow. But yes, I mean, it's good to frame it as the almost occupiers versus the occupied. And that's why I was saying earlier that the questionable thing about the creation of Israel after the Second World War was the location of the state of Israel. It was put in Palestine. Earlier, I seem to forget what I forget that word, but it was put in Palestine. And obviously, everyone knows why. That's because that was originally, historically, the Jewish homeland. But it was done in an incorrect fashion because it wasn't done in such a way as to respect the people who were already there. And I'm not an expert in property claims or whatnot, but I mean that there were people already living there, and so turning the clock back, if the creation of Israel were done all over again, I think what should have happened is they should have kind of dealt with the two groups of people. They should have preemptively kind of sorted out the situation, which they could have done. But they didn't, of course, because people weren't that concerned with the experience of Arab Muslims. They were concerned with the experience of the Jewish community, again via the Holocaust. So we could have had basically either a creation of a secular state which just included everyone in the area, or a two-state solution right then and there. People just weren't foresightful. People just didn't think ahead enough, unfortunately, which is why there's been so much conflict there to begin with. And I know that it is partly historical. I mean, in the sense that it predates Israel. Some of the issues going on there. Some of it is just Judaism versus Islam. And the clashes with that kind of culture. But a good portion of the conflict that we see now, from what I understand, does derive from the foundation of Israel, because that was really when tensions got high. Because what did Israel do? Israel started to expand. Israel took more and more territory because people thought, well, we deserve this land. This is our land. But I've kind of already gone over why it doesn't make sense to say one group has complete claim over the land and the other group has to, GTFO.
So I do want to make a quick point on the property claims, and then I'll touch on something you said, and I think I have a question. But okay, so on the property claims, I think in the end, it mostly does come down to, I guess, what I would consider like in quotes like valid property claims. And the reason I say it that way is because you can imagine, like, I'm sitting here doing this podcast, and if somebody, broke into my house had firepower, shot my wall. I get scared. I run out of my house. And then they just squat in my house. They hang out here for a couple days. I go to my parents' house. I get them to come with me. I get a gun. There's like 3 people with guns, and then we break back into the house. Then would it be like, well, is that an act of violence, or are they just taking back what's theirs? So you really do have to establish like who seems to have the legitimate claim, or else you don't know if it's like if you're just getting it back or not. And that's why it's just such a contentious situation, because nobody agrees on that claim. Now people can argue it's because of propaganda and because of and there is maybe really agreement on it. It's just Israel and U.S. are the exceptions. That's very possible. That's I think the reason why I've been most afraid to talk about it, though, is because that's the hard part to suss out. And I think it is straightforward. I just don't want to be falling for propaganda on either side. And so yeah, that's part I'm suspicious on, but I think I can leave that whole thing at that. And I think we kind of covered a lot of that ground. Okay, so now you made a point that is like, if there was a secular state and they all had rights, then it could have worked better if there's foresight. Well, to some extent, and you did cover this a little bit because you did mention that the tensions predate the state of Israel, because there's like religious tensions and things like that. But you are attributing a lot of the tensions to this unjust, occupation, people being forced out of their land and stuff like that. Well, that's what relates a lot to what Ron Paul says about blowback. So a lot of stuff that Ron Paul said about blowback is the whole problem with U.S. foreign policy is by being in places, we are incentivizing all of the hate against the United States, because we're showing up in other countries. And even if they are radicalized in the name of Islam and they attack the United States in the name of Islam, we gave them the grounds to do it because we bomb one terrorist and kill 25 innocent people. And now all the families of those 25 innocent people are now prone to radicalization because they know that our government was lazy and killed their innocent family members. So to some extent, it's a similar argument about how Israel occupied Palestine is kind of similar to that blowback situation. It's like, yeah, they just kind of saw these people as casualties of the situations. They did something that was widely perceived as unjust, and now they're the evil ones and they're going to get back at them. But a lot of people on the right kind of denounce that framing of things, partially because of the aforementioned property claims, but partially because of like actual anti-Semitism that does exist. And for that reason, they don't think a one-state solution is ever viable, because they think that the second you give the Arabs the right to vote, as well as with like the Palestinians, then the democracy will get anti-Semitic very quickly.
A one-state or two-state solution, just to be clear.
I'm talking about like a one-state solution. So if you had one secular state instead, like you didn't put in Israel in the first place, you put in one secular state, but everybody had the right to vote. A lot of people on the right would say that people who are Muslims and Arabs that are anti-Semitic will co-opt that government, and then you'll have issues with the Jewish population. And I'm pretty sure Jewish populations have not grown at the same rate as a lot of the Middle Eastern populations. So I don't think they're as protected by population growth over time, just for whatever reasons in their community. I think it also has to do with their general financial stability. I don't mean to dog whistle, but people who are wealthier generally don't have as many kids. So trends like that might have made them a minority in their secular nation, and then people be afraid of what could happen to them if they didn't have power. Now, it's easy for me to say, well, we've seen them in power. That's how you got the Gaza Strip. That's awful. But also in a secular state, would the Jewish people still be at risk if it was one state? Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a question often raised. There's a book, it's called The Genius of Judaism, but I forget the author. He's a French public intellectual. But, he basically raises this point in his book. He's like, well, the reason we need a strong Jewish state, is because when push comes to shove, the Jews have somewhere to go. That if there's a country out there that's Jewish, that's a Jewish state, the Jews have somewhere to go that is that will give them some protection if some horrible group or individual should come up and try to inflict suffering upon the Jewish community. But I don't think that's a really a good argument in favor of the Jewish state. Or to put it another way, I don't think that's the solution to anti-Semitism, or the solution to preventing genocides. I mean, because you can imagine a world, maybe, and this is a slightly oversimplistic thought experiment, but I mean, what if almost the whole world is against, it becomes, what if anti-Semitism just suddenly, dominates the world again? Because of course, as we made clear in the World War II episode, there was plenty of anti-Semitism across Europe and even on the Allied side. It wasn't just people like Hitler who were anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism predated Hitler by centuries. I mean, what if it just end up in a situation where the whole world's against Israel because anti-Semitism just takes over? I mean, that's it's not gonna, a state, it's like one singular state is not gonna really help in that scenario. So again, I mean, I think the state does exist. So unless we move to a post-state world, which we might, and I'm sympathetic to that idea, but until we do, states exist, and so I believe the state of Israel should not be dismantled. I think it should be reformed. Again, I would say they need to secularize their constitution. But the issue then, like Israel is just not a solution to, if you'll pardon the phrase, to steal from Karl Marx, the Jewish question. It's not a way to save them. Unfortunately, I think, to some degree, I think it has. Okay, this might be a slightly controversial statement, but I think it's defensible given what Israel's done. At some level, Israel has perpetuated or increased anti-Semitism through its terrible actions. Now, again, I mean, just to be clear, obviously, I'm not defending anti-Semitism. I'm not saying that's justified. But so there's just so many issues with that argument, I think, that you brought up, that I just don't, that's not my when I'm talking about, or if I come to defense of the state of Israel, that is the last argument I would use, because I think it's full of holes. It has a too cozy view of kind of human history and human nature.
So I think that the in quotes controversial statement you made is essentially though the whole blowback situation, right? It's you do something and it makes people hate you, and then you have to deal with it as a state or as a person that lives in a state. So you can argue that there's already a population there that's anti-Semitic, but then their actions isn't going to make it any better. And if anything, it makes people more prone to be co-opted by anti-Semitic messaging. So now I think this is the real concern about any type of solution, though, because if you had a one-state solution, which I know you're not really an advocate for, if you had a one-state solution, then I wouldn't be surprised if the Palestinians, would be quick to look for retaliation against the people who were, just moments ago their oppressor, if they got absorbed. And then if there was a two-state solution, I don't think they are okay with that either, because then they don't think that the other state's legitimate. It should all be theirs. Like I don't see any reason why one of the groups would compromise, because you have to just, I mean, ironically, it's the whole turn the other cheek, which you got to do a biblical reference if you're going to talk about the Israeli-Palestine issue. I guess that's New Testament, so I guess it's not as relevant. But to some extent, you have to even if you're going to do two-state forgiveness, if you think you're entitled to the whole area, then a two-state solution doesn't make sense to your party. You're still conceding and giving them a lot of stuff that you think is legitimately yours, and it to them is their holy sites. Even if we don't buy it, it is to them. So I just don't see a universe where even a two-state solution leads to peace. A two-state solution means they both have like formalized governments, but it doesn't mean any terrorism would stop. I wouldn't expect terrorism to stop if there was a two-state solution. So that's, I think on paper it's something that sounds good, and that's why I think a lot of the negotiations over the last few decades haven't gone anywhere, is because the reason why when Israel offers a two-state solution, the Palestinians say no, is because they think they're entitled to all of it. Right? Am I missing something?
Um, well, I'm a little fuzzy on the history, but I'm not that. I don't think I guess I just have a slight issue with the way you're framing it. And I guess it's and I've said things in the episode which are very critical of Islam. So I'm not and I'm not Muslim personally. Um, and obviously there we have an issue in this day and age with Islamic terror, and some of that, not all of it, but some of it goes back to um, the ideology and goes back to the religion. Um, but I actually think from what I can tell and from what I've read about it and the videos I've seen about it, it's really the Palestinians that have made more of an effort to come up with a two-state solution. It's generally Israel that's rejecting these peace offerings. Um, I mean, I don't expect a two-state solution to make everything perfect, but I just see it as the most practical solution, because then, and this is appeal. I know this will be appealing to an argument you detest, but then, at least to some degree, both the people of Israel and the people of Palestine will have some form of representation, and that they'll have some say in um, the policies that get enacted. Um, so, I mean, I that might not be a satisfactory answer, but I mean, I'm not. I guess when I say when I said earlier it's an easy thing to solve, obviously that's not the same thing as saying that that the two-state solution will introduce paradise in Palestine.
So to some extent, I think the reason why I'm pushing you and I'm kind of being hard on you is because I feel like if a college student went and had an internship with the UN, they would be saying what you're saying, and I feel like you're kind of giving UN type style arguments, and I'm critical of those arguments for the same reason I'm critical of a lot of like World Economic Forum type arguments for government policies. It's because I think it sounds practical because it sounds like the reasonable compromise, but reasonable compromises don't work in practice. It sounds like it works because like, well, at least they get representation. But in reality, if they have representation and then they're not winning a ton of elections, then all the people that have been absorbed will still think they're deeply oppressed. So even if they technically have the right to vote, these people are still going to want conflict because they're going to feel like that they're still being oppressed. And then and then the other way is if they do get representation and then they do have an effective coalition, then the Israelis are going to freak out because they're going to say, we were nice enough to do this and this, and then they got this, and now they're mobilizing something that we don't agree with. Now, I mean, you're arguing for a two-state solution, so you're not talking about them directly imposing things on each other. But when you're talking about the borders of that two states, there are other things that become contested when you have two nations that are next to each other and you have holy sites that are like in the picture, if that makes sense. So I don't know. I feel like it's something that one could say, and it sounds simple, and then in practice, I don't think it is. I know you're not trying to simplify it, but I'm just concerned for that reason. Like I don't see why either party would be happy with it, except for it's a compromise. But nobody in real life is happy with compromises.
So okay, a couple things here. One, I think we have to think about. So when we see the vitriol that comes from certain Palestinian camps, this, again, the propaganda, the anti-Semitism, et cetera, et cetera. I guess we have to kind of make a calculation, and we're making different calculations here, I think. But you have to make the calculation. Is that again a symptom of the terrible situation they're in, and would it be softened? Would it decrease if they were in a better situation politically, economically, socially, etc.? So in other words, would anti-Semitism go down if the Palestinians had representation or had their own form of government? Or is that just kind of how they feel? Is that just how the Palestinians feel? And it's just going to, the issue of anti-Semitism is just going to keep coming up regardless of a two-state solution. And I think, and this doesn't make it right again, but I think that a certain amount of that propaganda can't be taken literally. Again, it's not right, but I think people. I mean, this is kind of the weird thing with Occupy. Like when you have when your homeland, for a second, I'll just call the Palestinian homeland for a second. When your homeland is occupied, there and you don't have much representation or you don't have much power and influence to change it. People will say and do a lot of terrible things. This kind of gets connected to political violence, which maybe we want to get to pretty soon. But I think a lot of the anti-Semitism comes from kind of desperation. It's a verbal. It's a way to express their anger and frustration. Not a good way, nonetheless, but it is a way. And also, the other thing I think you have to keep in mind, I think there's the question of like, is it more an issue between individual Israelis and individual Palestinians, or is it an issue with the Israeli government and the United States meddling in these various situations? Because I think a big part of the issue is not even necessarily, oh, Jews and Muslims hate each other. I think the issue is Israel and the United States are being so unreasonable about the issue. And I realize I'm coming down when I'm talking about this. I'm coming down very harshly on the conservative position on this, and you're kind of playing devil's advocate slightly. But I mean, I think I have good reason to come down hard on the conservative position on this. But I mean, Israel and the United States really act like petulant children in this scenario. And the every president, I mean, most presidents for the last, I don't know how many years, but they've given so much funding to Israel. I mean, even the last president we had was, he openly came out and said, oh, no, we believe in settlements. No U.S. president had ever gone that far. But in effect, we support the settlements. We support the occupation. And that kind of goes into things we talked about before, which is, or you mentioned the blowback, we meddle in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and then we wonder why many Palestinians also produce anti-American propaganda. So I think when both sides have a greater degree of self-determination, I think that will decrease the tensions dramatically. And actually, there's a global consensus, and I forget the coordinates, or I couldn't tell you the exact, like how this draws on a map, but there's something called the 69 borders. Like this was a two-state solution proposed in 1969, and most people globally, I think, including quite a few Palestinians, are willing to take this solution, but the United States and Israel say no. So that would be an additional response to kind of what you're saying. You can say a little bit, and then maybe we should talk a little about political violence.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say before we shift to that general and more broad topic is the reason why I hold out like the least bit of skepticism, and I'm just kind of qualifying all my statements, is because in the end, this ties back to the property claims part, though. It's just there are things, like you haven't used the phrase holy sites that much, but there are parts of land there that, although you and I do not care about the spiritual resonance, the people that are fighting over the land do care about in a way that is beyond our appreciation. And because of that, I am not a party that could say what certain offers are more legitimate and which ones are better for both sides. And I'm not in a place to really say that these people are being deeply unreasonable for this and that. Like, it's easy to condemn Israel for the Gaza Strip stuff, and that's why I've done that. That's why I'm not echoing the conservative position, because I'm like, Israel's terrible and they're an awful state. But if we're talking about like practical politics and why don't both sides be reasonable, it's like, well, I can't even empathize with that type of I can't empathize with having that type of resonance with a location because of things that I believe are spiritual. I can't put myself in those shoes to do it, and that's why I feel like I would need to. I think we'd almost have to do a historical analysis and a cost benefit, and then like give, and then you have to figure out how generous we are with the interpretations. We have to figure out how malicious we think the rulers of each place are, or how genuine the terrorists are in their hate, or if they're been radicalized by Israel's actions. There's just so many things to weigh if we're talking about actual morals and motives and just that. In the end, it's easy for me to condemn as an anarchist this stuff in the Gaza Strip, but beyond that, I just have to qualify everything. But when we're talking about actual political violence in the broad context, and I know you want to say something, but you said I got the last word, so you're not allowed to. You got to talk about this topic for 40 minutes on this episode. So I'm moving on. When we talk about broad political violence, I thought that was interesting to touch on because I'm doing a bold prediction. I'm going to lock it in that we're going to see a summer of more riots, just like we saw last summer, because the Derek Chauvin trial is happening right now. The officer killed George Floyd, and that's been in the news the last couple of weeks. And it shouldn't be hard for anybody to remember a lot of the riots that happened last summer. And when you're talking to people who are on the right and left, there's all sorts of media about what type of rioting is okay, what type of looting is okay. And there are all these questions about when political violence is acceptable. So I just thought it's something that's interesting to take stock of now, because I think it's going to be something that is coming up more and more in the next few months. So I think I also, and I think we talked about this in the past, I find it a bit confounding to talk about because I have no affinity towards the government. This is why if you rewind 3 months to January 6th, I was perfectly okay with the quote unquote insurrection that happened, because I saw it as the people who steal from you got attacked by the people they were stealing from. And the people who rule over people that didn't want to be ruled by them fought back. And I think that's an okay use of political violence. Now, what happens in a lot of these riots is there's private property and people are attacking and defacing it and potentially attacking people, and they're lighting cars on fire that are of seemingly random origins, right? There can be a random car on the street or a random parking lot and all the cars get lit on fire. Now, some people will defend it because they'll say it's attacking broad systems. I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on this because I feel like they'll be much more nuanced than mine. The only reason it gets tricky for me is because I'm also anti-corporation to some extent, because I think most corporations are in league with the government. So I'm more open to certain types of violence against them, just like I'm against the government. But I know you don't have that sympathy that the government necessarily should be fought directly, or maybe I'm wrong. So this is really me challenging you on using the phrase anarchist sometimes, and then I'm pretty much forcing you in a position where you have to choose if you want to be on the FBI watch list or not. So what are some of your introductory thoughts when I kind of raise this issue for discussion?
So I'm gonna be a little tricky here. I'm gonna try to get in my. I'm gonna use the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm gonna talk about that a little more just to begin my thoughts regarding. I won't focus on other aspects of it. I'm gonna use that example as a springboard for political violence, because obviously many people when we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, what gets focused on, especially by media and by people like Ben Shapiro, it's like, oh, look at these suicide bombers, these are terrible people because suicide bombing is evil, and you can't have a two-state solution with suicide. I'm obviously exaggerating the argument for effect, but you can't have a two-state solution with suicide bombers. They're just gonna destroy everyone that doesn't agree with them. So, that's why we have to have a strong Israel, and that's why we can't allow the Palestinians to have a seat in the UN and have a two-state solution and all that. But it gets tricky, because I think I'm not willing to say I'm not a pacifist, right? And I think I said this in the World War II episode, but I'm not a pacifist. I don't believe that all violence is always unjustified. Um, like so when I'm like um, when I'm defending the Palestinians more than the Israelis in that conversation, um, you can't really just say oh, we can't have a two-state solution because suicide bombers, because of the difficult situation that the Palestinians find themselves in, and sometimes I guess this means I am accepting that I'll be on the FBI watch list. Oh well. Sometimes you can't just protest outside, the Capitol peacefully with signs and shout, catchy slogans. So it's like when I think about when I'm thinking about the Palestinians, and then I'll broaden the conversation. When I think about the Palestinians, I think, well, I mean, I don't support suicide bombing. Yet I at least know why it's gotten to that point. And I think you have to know why it gets to that point, and you have to respect, you have to kind of you have to at some level, I guess, accept that violence is not always immoral. Because and the funny thing, I guess, that I see about this really is everybody, or not everybody, but most people you talk to, even people in mainstream media, they believe this. They just couch their arguments in cozy, ideas about everyone living together in peace and harmony and whatever. It's like the late Christopher Hitchens, later on became a supporter of the Iraq and Afghanistan war. It's like, well, there's a lot of violence that goes into supporting wars. Or I mean, poke fun of the conservatives again. I mean, Ben Shapiro, I'm sure, is a patriotic American, and he feels like, oh, the American, the founding fathers of the United States were justified in fighting a war against Great Britain because Great Britain was being oppressive and taking away their rights, and we had to fight back. It's like, okay, well, you're using violence. And then it's like another, an aspect of the gun control debate again is like, well, we need the right to bear arms, because if the government becomes too tyrannical, we're going to use the guns to rise up and, fight the tyrants. But again, you're using violence. So what I find striking, I guess, about violence is, at some level, everyone seems to justify violence to some degree in certain scenarios. You just can't say that in this current political climate, because you're seen as a crazy person and possibly dangerous. So those are my opening remarks.
So I agree that everybody does it in certain situations. Everybody has the bounds of when violence is okay, but that's also why I wanted to hear your take, because I wanted to know when you think violence is okay. Because I know for me, I think the government is aggressing against me via taxation and stealing my stuff. And when I try to make voluntary transactions, they try to criminalize it, or they try to steal a bunch of my money. So I think I have justifiable claims to be violent. I'm not planning on it, but I think I have that right. Now, I don't think you agree with that. Well, I mean, like, the only reason I don't agree with doing it is for game theory purposes, because I would lose. And that's why if you advocate that in the liberty movement, they assume you're a Fed that wants them to go and all set up a Waco situation so they can paint all the liberty people as crazy. So there's good game theory reasons to not do it, but I don't think you'd even agree that that's a legitimate reason. So I guess I'm curious on what your barometer of when legitimate political violence is okay, like where that line is for you.
I mean, I don't know. Sometimes I find myself on this podcast, I'm always worried about giving evasive answers, but sometimes I feel like I give evasive answers because I'm not sure there's you're looking like, I know you're looking for a straightforward answer, but then sometimes we talk about issues that I'm not sure there's a straightforward answer for. So it's like, I mean, again, to tie it back, I don't know why I keep bringing up World War II, but like to tie it back there, it's like I was like I thought it was right for the Allies to fight against fascist Italy, Japan, and Germany. But there were massive casualties, like because of that. The Allies killed, God knows how many people in that process. So, I mean, I'm going to say I'm going to say just a generic statement, and then kind of maybe get more specific or give some examples, some more examples. I mean, violence is justified when the alternative would lead to more. Like violence is justified when the alternative is worse. Violence is justified when there is more suffering, or there are more issues if you do not use violence. So I mean, again, like I think the Allies were correct to fight against 20th century fascism, because it would have been worse if they had not. So you have to you have to like take it case by case, and you have to kind of make your own assessment. It's not exact science. You got to make your own assessment about when you think a situation is not reformable, and you have to make like that has to be direct action. So I guess another example might be um, well, I was going to say the Russian Revolution, but you could also even say the French Revolution, or many revolutions throughout history. I mean, people like to deprecate revolutions, like, oh, the French Revolution was a failure. Rip, checkmate, all you radical crazy people. It's like, well, I mean, there was a reason that all these different revolutions in the different scenarios took place, and I think they were justified. I mean, the Ancien Régime, if you'll appreciate my terrible French, was it was a very terrible government. Now, Louis XVI wasn't a particularly bad king, comparatively speaking, but I mean, the old regime was not doing what I think a government should be doing. So I think it was justified for people to rise up against that. Same was for the provisional government in Russia. So I'm sure you're not satisfied with my answer, but I'm not sure I can give you an answer that satisfies you. I mean, like in terms of the current situation we live in, I don't support violence, because I think I think there's still a possibility of reforming what we have right now. Um, and I think I made so um I was on Keegan's YouTube channel. He and I did a live stream with another gentleman whose name I forget. Um, but we did a live stream about like kind of it was essentially about the Biden presidency, but we ended up talking more about like the difference between being a reformer and direct action, and actually like doing something to change the system completely, like dismantling a system versus reforming a system. And I just I made the argument. I said, I want to, I'm going to be the last person I'm like, you can think of me almost, and this is kind of me arguing against myself, but this is the position I find myself in. I'll be the last person who jumps off a train that's heading straight for a cliff. I'm the last person because I think, there's still a chance that we can stop that train, and there's still a chance that we won't go off that cliff. I don't think our situation is to the point where it's completely hopeless. Now, it might be getting there, and it might get there. I mean, I hope it doesn't get there in our lifetimes, but it might. It might get there in my niece's lifetimes. But that would be, I guess, why I disagree with you in terms of like the Capitol rioters on January 6th. And I don't even think they were. I think you're kind of in a situation where you have strange bedfellows going on, because you're not really supporting the rioters for for the reasons they were rioting. You just support the rioters because you hate the federal government. But I mean, the rioters weren't even revolting because, oh, government is evil and we gotta dismantle the system. They were rioting because they were under the delusion that Trump won the election. So
Yeah, I mean, and for people who are listening audio only, I was nodding along with that. Like I recognize that I don't think they were rioting for the right reasons, assuming it was even rioting, because I know we have disagreements on how even extreme the situation was. But all that's aside the point. You did get to an answer in the middle of what you're saying, right when you said, I don't think I'd give an answer that would satisfy me. Right before that, you were actually saying something I was okay with, because at first you were it was sounding like you were outlining when you're practically for a type of standing up to a government, and then you kind of strayed into the actual morality of it, and you kind of explain where you see certain revolutions being moral against their rulers. Okay, I mean, I disagree with you, but I'm not unsatisfied by that answer, and I can see a lot of people who are in the liberty movement, them giving a similar answer. Now, I just don't think that answer stands up for people in the liberty movement, because I don't think there is any hope that it goes in the direction that people who want like freedom in a libertarian sense, and by that I mean like a political anarchist ANCAP sense. I don't think there is hope for that. So the things you said, I would be okay with somebody saying if they had more of your worldview, because I think from your worldview and what you want to be normative, I could, and then you're, I guess, not, you don't have the same lens of interpreting economics like I do, then you're less likely to think that it's all going downhill because of it. And I am. So I think even if I use your interpretive structure, if I apply my values to your structure, then it's okay for me to have the views I have. I just don't think we agree on things that I guess are quantitative in a sense.
I mean, it is going down. The situation is going downhill. I just don't think it's you think it's past the point. Well, you don't want to reform it, and I think we should attempt to reform it. That's why. I mean, we are heading, as I say. I mean, I was using the metaphor of a train heading towards a cliff for a reason. We are in a very precarious position, both as in terms of the country, our country of birth, the United States, and the world. I just don't think it's gotten to the point where I'm willing to take up the band of revolution and say, we got to completely get rid of this government and create something new.
You and I have different views on what the cliff is, though. That's what I was trying to add to it. So the things that are normative for you, if they worked, I would say I don't want that. So you think I think you think it's redeemable, because even if you see it going in a direction you don't like, you can imagine a world where it gets shifted to your worldview. I can't imagine a world where it gets shifted towards my worldview. I could see it getting shifted towards yours, but my worldview, I don't see the government willingly abolishing itself, and I think that is the proper end goal, right? Is abolition. And I haven't seen a time in the United States history where they've like consistently rolled back any type of administration, or any type of executive power, any type of legislative power, any type of administrative power. It's been done like in short bursts on small ways, but not in a dramatic way. And when people cite like Reagan for hope, that's stupid. I think that's anti-historical. So I don't see any evidence for me to think that things can be reformed in the direction I see fit. And I think you and I just disagree on the cliff, which might be why you have more hope for reform than I do. Is that an okay way of saying it, though? Because I think that's true. Okay. Now, there was one thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap up, and it is specific and it is controversial because some people don't think Antifa exists. And I mentioned to you off air that I was that I was listening to Andy No's book about Antifa, and you have to take it with a huge grain of salt, because it's really funny in a sense, because, well, one, so given the things you just laid out, you do see reform. So you're not really in line with those types of folks, because they are of your ilk in terms of normative worldview. Yet they're the ones that are rioting and want the institutions to fall. So I'm the strange bedfellow with them, even though they have your ideology. Now, I think Andy No and a lot of right-wing people give Antifa too much credit for being very creative and tactical and coordinated. And to some extent, if I buy the narrative that they're actually effective at it, it's kind of inspiring because I'm a person who's pro-revolution, and I think, why aren't the liberty movement people doing this? Because if they're as efficient as Andy No says, then that's pretty cool. Why aren't we the ones doing that? But I don't think they are. I think the people who don't think Antifa is real are more accurate. I think they're fairly disconnected, and I think a lot of them are just kind of doing random things. So I was kind of wondering, especially given what you just said about why you're not for trying to dissolve everything and doing a French Revolution here. What do you think of the folks who are?
Well, I mean, the thing about Antifa, as I understand it, I mean, we could say, I think we've talked about this slightly before on another podcast. I mean, we could say it exists as long as we're not saying it's not like the Bolsheviks, where like the Bolsheviks were like a very like there was a thought out ideology, there was a party structure. It doesn't exist if we're talking about like a really full fledged political party or organization. It's just a collection of anarchists and socialists and Marxists, and I mean I'm against Antifa, I guess, because generally because it goes against my arguments about attempting to reform, and I think the Antifa is a good target for the right. I think the right can use them and then use that to justify attacks against people like Bernie Sanders, let's say, who's not part of Antifa. So both tactically and in terms of I guess my pragmatic goals in the short term, I'm against Antifa. But the difference between, say, Antifa and their leaders of the French Revolution, well, there's many differences, but one is they're completely ineffective. The revolution is not going to happen anytime soon, as far as I can tell. So yeah, we could say that Antifa is like kind of advocating for a French Revolution type situation. They're just complete failures at it, and they're not getting anywhere, and they're not getting any support because the average person, the average American, despite the polarization we often talk about on this show, the average American isn't going to be joining a revolution. The average American wants to, have as pleasant of a life as they can, go have some money in their bank, maybe have a family or friends and hobbies. So I don't worry about like Antifa in the sense that I'm worried they're going to be guillotining people in the streets tomorrow. But I do that they're a disruption to, I guess, my calls to reform. So that would be why I'm not a supporter. Even if I'm more on the radical end than your average Democratic voter or politician.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. I mean, well, the only I guess criticism of that point you make that I would levy at you is, I think your language is a little all or nothing. Like I think people can recognize Antifa as a uncollected movement that is not going to actually overthrow the government, but then still say like that they're real and that they have caused trouble and they have still had some political action, have had some political effect. I mean, in Portland, there's the whole situation where they kind of dominate a few streets and they wreak havoc and everybody's afraid to do anything about it. And I know that they've vandalized certain people's houses and made people afraid to vote against certain things, especially like Democrats that are more moderate have been, like, I guess, terrorized by them into making certain votes. Now I don't, and to some extent, that's the stuff that I respect about Antifa in terms of like scaring their legislators, because if we talk about democracy a lot now, I'd say like, well, if voting's not working, if you make your representatives know how much you want something to not get passed because you threaten them, and you're anonymous and you can't get tracked down, then it's like that's pretty effective at getting your voice out there and getting action to take place. And as much as I don't like democracy, it's like, well, that was pretty effective. But nobody's worried about a libertarian contingent burning down Mitch McConnell's house if he passes $2 trillion in spending, right? So that's where I kind of give Antifa credit, where it's like, well, people are legitimately, like, they're elected officials that are afraid that Antifa will, like I don't know if you remember, but Tucker Carlson got doxxed more or less. Like his address got put out there. And like that was probably pretty scary for Tucker Carlson. Like he works for Fox News, so he's not going to change his tune. But if Antifa gets somebody's information that's like a moderate Democrat, like that person could get terrorized into doing something. And that's a pretty effective tactic. And that's the kind of stuff where I'm saying, like, from a Machiavellian standpoint of being very much like wanting the levers of power to put what they want into play because they think the state's evil, like it makes sense to me. So I guess that's where I'm trying to like weirdly give them credit, even though I think their ideology is bad. And I think usually their violence isn't effective. Usually it's senseless. Usually it's gross. But there have been some times where they've done things that I'm like, whoa, that's pretty scary that a small mobilized force could do something impactful. I think that's the reason why I found it a little bit fascinating when I thought about it more. Yeah.
2 quick points. One, I guess I was using all or nothing language because, maybe I just don't. Maybe I just live in my own little media bubble, and I'm missing all these particular stories you're talking about. But I just don't see. I don't view Antifa as that much of a threat. Now, yeah, I mean, people get doxxed, and obviously I'm not for that. Streets get closed. There's rioting. There's looting. Stores get broken into and burned down. So there is some obviously material cost, and human cost to these activists. I think people on the right overblow it, and they talk they talk like, it's the second coming of Joseph Stalin, and we're all going to become in the. So that was really why I was kind of downplaying Antifa. I was trying to correct for that mistake. But I guess the other thing I would say, and to connect it back again to Israel and Palestine, I think we have to understand why these people are looting, why these people are rioting, why these people are taking over streets. And they're doing it because our I hope I don't sound like I'm virtue signaling here, but the system we have is really corrupt, and people aren't getting their needs met. And the U.S. government really doesn't give a darn about us, that the average person. And so I can understand, and I'm not necessarily even going to make that moral of a judgment about the looting or the rioting in that context, in the same way that I'm not just going to dismiss the Palestinians because of the suicide bombings that might happen. You have to understand Antifa's grievances. You have to understand why they're doing what they're doing. So that's why I'm not moralizing about it. Even if in practical terms, looting a store isn't what I would do in terms of my political action, but I understand that for many people the situation is desperate enough to where that makes sense, in a weird way. So yeah, I'm kind of
Okay.
arguing all over the place, but I just, that's where I find myself. I don't see a way to really kind of smooth over these contradictions, and I don't really care to, because I think to accept contradictions in situations like this is to really truly be, well, I guess closer to reality to some degree.
See, I'm okay. I'm gonna wrap this up in a second. I'm just hesitant to use the word contradictions because I think a lot of things are fuzzy, but I don't think because things are fuzzy, I don't think it follows that things contradict themselves. Like I think the Antifa thing is a fuzzy thing. I think when you try to suss out, like, well, and this is not you but me, when I try to suss out when government is a corporation because it's doing what the government tells them, like all that is fuzzy, but I don't think it's necessarily contradictory. I think that almost accidentally you might be undermining yourself or selling yourself short, but I know a lot of people you like use that type of language. But to wrap us up, because we talked a lot about a lot of stuff there, and I actually feel like that was fairly productive and for the most part interesting. It's just a lot to chew on. But you can find more episodes on our podcast feed or on our YouTube channel. We've done, I guess, 51 other episodes at this point where we've gone back and forth on all kinds of issues ranging from our political ideals, our philosophical foundations, to just talking about philosophy in general, where I get to be a complete doofus about stuff. And then we've even done some episodes that are like very much about contemporary politics at the moment stuff came out. So we've covered all sorts of stuff. If you want to browse through that, and if anything catches your eyes, give it a listen. That would be great. And you can like and subscribe and leave ratings and all that good stuff, or leave a comment. You can find me. I do a solo show. It's the Obey Podcast. You can find me on Twitter at the Obey Podcast or at Matthew T. Keck. On that show, I just rant about stuff for like 25 minutes. It's usually very contemporary. Like I want to cover how China is going to turn their currency into a digital currency soon. They're making moves on that. That has all sorts of implications. I rant on stuff like that. It's like weird stuff in the Wall Street Journal that kind of gets covered. A lot of stuff about how the federal government hates you. And Matt, do you want to tell them where they can find you?
Yeah. So originally we put Beyond Talking this podcast on video form onto my YouTube channel, The Anti-Philosopher. I sometimes do political videos. Sometimes I do more philosophical videos or book reviews or TV show reviews. Just really whatever catches my fancy. You can find my content there. Again, YouTube, The Anti-Philosopher. Oh, and just for a joke, I'm not an ANCAP, but I just want to say this to anyone listening. ANCAPs of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your property.
Nice. I thought you were going to make the joke that I thought of because when you said the anti-philosopher, I was thinking like you really messed up in branding. You could have leaned into Antifa, and then you could be the Antifa-philosopher. But you goofed up. It's just anti-philosopher. So you can find us all there. You can check out more content where we're ranting and going off about all kinds of stuff. If you enjoyed this video. But for now, signing off. It's Matt and Matt.